So we make sure that if we're going to do anything, we make sure we document everything. It's not 55-page documents or anything, but we make sure it's documented so that people have a legal right to come back and say, well, no, I'm entitled to be paid some money.
Yeah.
Or transfer it back to me.
Yeah, you can't just take everything on trust, and it's tough because it's family, but this is business that you're talking about as well, and you're not supposed to mix those sometimes.
Yeah.
Families are volatile.
Succession isn't sexy. No one likes thinking about death and what will happen after they're gone, but as Mellor Olsson lawyers Matt Dorman and Callen Bubner say, burying your head in the sand doesn't change the reality we all must face one day. And the one thing you can do is be prepared. Matt and Callen spend the bulk of their time helping agribusiness families craft and implement succession and estate plans, laying a solid foundation for the future anyone can rely on when that time comes. This conversation will give you the nuts and bolts of how it all works and answer the sort of questions you might have in the back of your mind from time to time. Here's Matt and Callen.
Welcome to Healthy Minds, Healthy Vines, the wellbeing podcast for growers, proudly brought to you by the Wine Grape Council of South Australia and sponsored by PIRSA. Hosted by award-winning mental health podcaster Callum McPherson and wine columnist for The Australian, Nick Ryan.
Callen, you're a country boy from the EP.
Yes.
Why have you chosen to practice in rural areas?
Look, I grew up in Woodner on the Eyre Peninsula, so I had sort of really fond memories growing up there. And when I finished my law degree, I thought, well, look, I wanted to go back out there and enjoy living that lifestyle at some point in time. And I thought I may as well do it while I'm younger. So I started off in Port Lincoln, moved to Whyalla, and now on to Clare. And I haven't looked back. So I've really enjoyed living out there. I think, especially practicing law, we get a whole broad spectrum of people and a variety of work. We're not sort of pigeonholed into anything in particular. And more recently, since I've been in Clare, I've particularly enjoyed working with a lot of farmers and grape growers and things like that. It's been, really rewarding. You get to be the family lawyer, and I just really quite enjoy the lifestyle out there that it offers. And I'm raising my kids out there now as well, and the local footy club and all that sort of stuff, which is
Do you play?
Excellent. Could
be the last year this year.
What are you, a demon or a rooster?
No, I'm a eagle, a min-man eagle.
Min-man boy,
okay. Yeah, so yes, there's a few of us older codgers getting around, so but no, the lifestyle.
That's in the resis, is it?
In the resis, yeah.
I don't mean to profile you.
Definitely the resis, yeah. So no, that's, I know that you still have a lot of those opportunities in the city, but just, I'm quite community minded, and I like to get involved and stuff like that. So it's really rewarding.
Nice. And what about you, Matt? Are you a countryman or?
No, born and bred Adelaide, lived in Adelaide all my life. Came across to Mellor Olsson in 2011, and Mellor Olsson's had a really big rural, regional footprint. 2013, we ended up merging with a Port Lincoln firm, which also gave us an Auburn, at the time now Clare firm, where Callen's working in that office. And as part of that, obviously, did a lot of regional work dealing with rural people, farmers, etc. What happened is that the people that were running those offices ended up leaving. Callen has got the Clare office, so I was sort of managing that with Callen now. He's a partner, he's taken that over. And basically, Port Lincoln still needs a partner and a manager. So that's why I was saying that I live every sort of second week up in Port Lincoln, but I travel all over the countryside, and most of my work these days is doing agricultural work and dealing with regional people and farmers, which I love.
Yes, you feel at home in the country despite being a city slicker at heart?
I do, but I just have to keep it a bit quiet from my wife. So she does wonder why I want to be out there all the time, but I can't get her out there at the moment. So,
have you guys had much of an opportunity to work together over the years? Because you've been there a decade as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I guess so. There was a previous partner in the Clare office, Greg Anderson, who retired in about 2019, 2020, and then sort of since then, Matt and I have worked a lot closer on a variety of matters. And the work we do sort of intertwines with each other. And So yeah, we do often work together on a lot of things.
Still the first person I ever saw pick 4 glasses of wine by variety blind, Greg Anderson, when I was a kid. And I remember thinking it was the most impressive thing I'd ever seen. He went, that one's the Shiraz, that one's the Cabernet. And in hindsight, it was maybe he set it up and maybe it was a bit easier than I thought. But at the time, I was blown away by who was this godlike creature who could name these.
There you go. He's never forgotten.
No, never forgotten.
Maybe it was a lucky guess.
No, I think Greg had a pretty good, still has a pretty good palate.
Yeah,
loves his wine.
He does.
Probably has a pretty good cellar as well, I would think.
Yeah.
From being up there, yeah.
So you've worked across a range of areas. What stands out about succession?
Look, from my perspective, when we deal with farmers, you're always dealing with land, you're always dealing with how they're going to pass down to the next generation to the children, what to do with off-farm kids, on-farm kids. It's so specialised and tax implications, etc., that I just really enjoy the work. I find that people at the end of it normally shake your hand as lawyers. It's nice to get your hand shaken at the end of a matter, and they really appreciate it. And it's such an important thing for farmers, agricultural people in their lives, really. I mean, everything is about the farm, and getting that right. They really value the advice and getting it done.
Yeah, I imagine some people might think, it's the kind of thing they can sort out amongst themselves around a kitchen table, and it's only when it goes horribly wrong that they realise they may have made a better decision along the way.
Some have tried, yeah. I mean, a lot of the times people will have already made the decisions on what they want to happen, and it's us implementing it.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time also that we have to be there for the to assist them with the advice to begin with, and what our experience might be with other people.
So what are the basics, Callen, when someone starts the process? What are you what ducks are you getting in a row to start off with?
Well, yeah, it varies a lot between clients. So it's funny because succession planning, particularly when you're dealing with farmers and their businesses, their life in general, it touches on nearly everything. Even when we're engaged to do a relatively simple conveyance, they come to us, they go, we've purchased this paddock or this vineyard or whatever. What entity should I put this in? And invariably the conversation might go, well, have you got a trust? How many different trusts do you have? Is there someone that's likely to take over the business at some point or another? So even with it just seems to touch everything, getting your will set up, getting the power of attorney. But I guess there's clients come to us at various different stages. So we might have some, young families, succession, might be in the back of their mind, but they're nowhere near implementing it. So it might be just looking at making sure their structures are right. Whereas some clients come to us and go, all right, we are ready to pass control over. And then we have to start looking at some of those critical things going, okay, well, this is how your entities are held. This is how you're trading. How are we going to be able to take that from point A to point B? And invariably it then involves conversations with their accountant and, their planners, and making sure those exiting parties are supported in their retirement but without breaking the back of the business itself, which can be easier said than done.
How much lead time are people often wanting to give? Are they coming to you, a couple of weeks before and saying, all right, sweet, we're ready to start now? Or do people realise?
It's independent, really. I mean, I've had succession plans that have taken, 3 years. You go through a whole process from the beginning of restructuring, then you do an estate plan as part of that. And then afterwards, and the restructure, then you've got to get banks involved, which could take a few months and etc. So, but I've had others where it's going to be, financial year dependent. So you're only going to get a tax break in that financial year. So you do have to get things done quickly on those matters, but it's a mixed bag.
Yeah.
I think it's always better to be too early than too late though, right?
Definitely.
Correct. And the hardest part also is this sort of, the juggling of, do I hold on to everything until I die and pass it through a will, or do I look at doing a succession plan earlier and retiring and passing it on then? And that can be quite difficult to do with some people. I mean, probably half do it one way, half do it another way. And there's no right or wrong answer, but that can cause some friction.
How common is it for ag businesses to have a plan in place?
I wouldn't say necessarily it's overly common to have a written plan. I think a lot of people have something in mind and have maybe discussed that as a family. It may not have a particular shape or form, but certainly I think, especially with transitioning of control at that point in time, most people have a plan set out. And, in terms of timing of the transition of control and, roles and responsibilities after that. But yeah, again, it's a real mixed bag, and none are the same, and it all depends on you. A lot of it can be dictated by the family as a whole. So, if you've got a disruptive family member, it might, bring forward some of these matters, or if everyone's getting along, they might go about it a completely different way. So yeah, I guess we do a lot of work in setting up those plans and formalising something, but often it's almost at the end of it.
Yeah. I mean, do you then let the process take some of the emotion out of it? I mean, these are pretty emotive situations a lot of time. I mean, families are families. God, I can't agree with mine on on what we're buying each other for Christmas, let alone something significant like dividing up large properties.
Well, that's the big issue. I mean, especially in agriculture, is that, most of the family's wealth is in the land. You got plant and equipment, stock, these sort of things, but it's mainly in the land. So if you've got sort of 4 children and 1 or 2 are going to farm, then how do you provide for the other 2? And that's where the problem lies. And without some really good communication between the family at the time of doing a succession plan, including the off-farm children, it can be disastrous. That being said, I've had plenty of succession plans where it can be disastrous anyway, even if there is the communication between them.
Yeah.
And you're right what you were saying earlier about getting in early, because if you get in early enough, you might be able to sort of divert assets outside of the farm into other areas such as superannuation and things.
Yeah, that are looking after those.
Can assist with the off-farm farm kids. So yeah, but it's a mixed bag. I mean, we get all sorts, but the earlier you get onto it, the better. Just a lot of people don't want to deal with that. They don't want to think about it.
Yeah, well, and thinking about things you don't want to think about. Everyone likes the idea of maybe, riding off in the sunset at 90 and everything taken care of, but that doesn't always happen. And, people, die suddenly without wills or without plans sort of put in place. I mean, that could be a disaster to work through.
Oh, huge. Yeah, especially if you haven't got it. As I was talking about the restructuring to begin with, making sure that it's in the right structures to begin with, because, if you've got a situation where land is in personal names and you do fall off the perch, unfortunately, it goes through a will, and wills can be contested.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of different structures and things that we can put in place for that. But if you don't get to it in time, and unfortunately you don't have a crystal ball to know when you're going to fall off the perch on.
So what's early?
Well, really, as soon as they're really back on the farm, that's kind of how I see it. So, we've got some young farmers and grape growers that they might not even necessarily have any control in the family's operation as yet, but they are looking at these things going, all right, have we got a will set up in place? They might have some control within the trading entity. What happens to that control if I die? So I don't think, there's any sort of age. And I think, the younger generation are actually a lot more aware of the problems around succession planning. And we're getting a lot of young families coming in going, all right, how does this look for me? What do I need to have in place so there isn't going to be that problem? So you definitely can't be too young to start having those conversations around succession planning.
And when you start working with one family member, do you inherently have to involve everyone else, or are you just working for them? How's that work?
Generally speaking, you're either going to have mum and dad coming along and asking the question, or you're going to have the children, and you could have all of them. Now, at one point, we've got to be careful of conflicts, obviously. Yeah. So generally speaking, we can talk to everyone, but then everyone can go and get their own documents. Just coming back to the question, though, of an age, you've got to remember that some of these farmers that were in agriculture might not actually get the land or anything until they're sort of later in life themselves. So if mum and dad do hang on for dear life, it may be that they don't actually inherit it as part of their succession for a long period of time. So how early? Just depends on when they get the land and when they can do things. But the best thing that they can do is, whilst they're waiting for that, is to try and build up assets outside of the farm. Otherwise, they may be stuck with just inheriting the farm, and then they will then have that problem.
Yeah.
What holds people back from getting this stuff organised? I mean, they probably have a bit of a sense of there's going to be some stuff to sort through down the line. Is it that that seems like a lot of work. I think naturally as humans, we don't like thinking about death, and perhaps would like to imagine that that's not going to happen sometimes. That probably factors in as well. From what people have said to you or what you've noticed, what stops people from getting this sorted?
Not wanting to think about death is one of them.
When people just come in to do a will and they'd say, so if I die, I would like this.
Yeah.
It's not about if.
Yeah.
Yes.
Take the word if out of that.
Yeah.
I think it's that. I think it's people, and I see that a lot in agriculture, is that people want to continue to farm forever. They love it. I understand why they love it. And they sort of think, well, if I'm going to pass down to the next generation, what if that next generation now doesn't include me in this? There are people that want to retire. They get the house on the beach or whatever, but a lot of them still want to live on the land. And I think one of the other major issues that we see is that people don't want to pass over during their lifetime. They're also quite concerned about, in-laws and what happens if we pass the land down to a younger child with an in-law, and what happens upon them separating.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden we have to break the farm up. So that's what I was saying earlier about people holding on and doing it through a will or doing it earlier. I think a lot of people who do it through a will, it's one of those reasons, is that, we don't want to see the farm broken up in our lifetime.
Yeah. And I think sometimes, say with some of the vineyards, and particularly, in places like the Barossa where there are generational, holdings, and people go, well, we've sort of got it right, previous generations, do we just keep it going that way? Or, it's a much more complex situation now, I'd imagine. It's not like, 100 years ago where elder son just takes over and off you go.
Yeah.
Well, I think the other issue is that, and, I know vineyards haven't gone up in value the same as other sort of cropping land and things around South Australia. But, if you look at some of the other land in farming, you've gone from something that might have been worth $2 million 15 years ago to $20 million.
Yeah.
All of a sudden you've got people have got land holdings of $50 million sitting around the place, if not more. So, you're now talking about a lot more money, and the whole family knows that. The children know that, the on-farm kids know it, the off-farm kids know it. So I think that's probably the younger ones are driving it a lot more to say, look, we want to make sure we're going to get this right, because if we get it wrong, it could be a huge problem. Whereas before it might not have, from a monetary point of view, been such an issue.
Anecdotally, what have you seen happen when there isn't a plan in place, or that plan hasn't been executed as it needs to? I wouldn't say horror stories, but
there's definitely a few horror stories getting around, and I think the worst case is where it does rely on a will to pass down, and then there is an inheritance claim. And then there's a test for provision, and that ultimately might mean the sale of the farm. So that is the absolute worst case. So and it does unfortunately happen, but. And often I get so many clients now who hear those horror stories and have seen the end result of it, and that prompts a conversation with someone like myself going, okay, well, I've heard about Joe Bloggs down the road. How do I avoid getting into that situation? But I think there's a fair bit of stigma attached with succession planning as well. Like I know I've had some clients have had some issues with succession planning and, divorces and things like that. And I know they've said to me, like, they're just incredibly embarrassed about it. Like everyone wants that happy family and, don't want to be spoken about down the pub or whatever. So, it can be a really tricky barrier for clients to go, okay, well, I'm now ready to do this, that, and the other. The other thing, I should say, is that I think one of the biggest barriers in terms of succession planning is I feel like a lot of people think that succession planning should be very straightforward in that, okay, we want this here and we want it to go from there to there. But in reality, when they go and try to work it out for themselves, they will go, geez, I don't know if I want this to go here or want that to go there, and what about the other kids? And they just get in a big jumble. Whereas we often see situations where we might be perhaps even just restructuring land to enable succession. Doesn't necessarily mean you need to make a decision right now about this going here or this going there.
More easily transferable.
It's just getting those vehicles right so that, ultimately in 5 years' time, when you review your will the next time, we can work out exactly where it is.
But it's not like a template, fill in the gaps kind of process. Every farm is unique and needs its own approach.
Yeah, and a lot of people are very, they'll just bury their head in the sand and go, I don't know what to do here. I'm just going to leave it as it is.
Well, one of the big problems is that depending on your land holding or what it's worth, and also depending on the business turnover, you might not get tax concessions along the way. So you might have to wait for a year in which it's a bad year or something, and actually that's the year that you do a restructure, even though you don't want to have the bad year. But in actual fact, that's probably a good thing if you want to get your succession plan done, because all of a sudden you've got land, like I was saying, going from $2 million to $20 million. You transfer it, you got a capital gains tax problem. Yeah. It's going to be significant. No one can afford to pay it. So, there are some restrictions as to what you can and can't do on any given year.
Have you seen some generational change, an uptick in more people requesting these services? And
definitely. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's been enough horror stories getting around that certainly the younger generation is much more aware of the problems that can arise from it. And yeah, I'm having those conversations a lot, with clients that are a lot younger than perhaps generally would otherwise be. I don't know if you see the same thing, but yeah.
Yeah, I think back in, probably, and it might have even been before my time starting practicing, but a lot of everyone used to say, well, let's just leave it for the will. Let's not think about the planning of things there, and we'll just deal with it in a will. That doesn't seem to be the case anymore. We put together a lot of succession deeds and transfer portions of trusts and companies and business structures now, and put the right things in place, right? And the will's the end part.
Yeah.
At the end of it, most of the time the will is something I would do last that really doesn't have much in it, because everything else is all dealt with in other deeds and other structures.
Yeah, so the will is just the document that presses the button on various things that you've laid out underneath.
Yeah.
Correct. That's right.
So there's a bit of stigma involved, there's pride involved, a bit of an attitude sometimes that, a happy family should be able to sort it out for themselves without getting other people involved. Is that?
Oh, potentially. I think they can bury their head in the sand if they know it is going to blow up. So they go, well, I don't want to have to deal with this mess right now. That can be somebody else's problem later on.
But later on always arrives.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So I don't know. I feel like a lot of this, it can be tricky, especially with families that aren't necessarily getting along, because, I feel like with succession planning, most people, their two primary goals, I think, is to ensure they've got a sustainable business that can actually be passed on and can continue on for generations, but also having a happy family. That doesn't necessarily mean they need to make sure everyone gets the same or an equal amount or whatever, but it's just so long as their own self-interests are satisfied, I suppose. I think that's, the two things when people are coming to talk to me, that's generally what we're talking about, is going, okay, well, I've got this farm, I want it to go to here, but I've got, these kids over here that aren't going to get anything, and how do I fix this up? And that's where we can we can give them a whole range of options, and generally we find a way through. And I've heard some really lovely stories where we've set up something for now. They've had the kitchen table conversation after it. One of them was really cool in that we were actually giving some farming land to the off-farm kids as a means to even up, I suppose. And there was a really nice conversation where the kids that were getting that said to their mum and dad, when we get it, can we lease it back to the farmer? We were like, that's exactly what we want. So, and they were really sort of anxious about having that conversation. And, and now they've spoken, they've communicated, but, that's probably the exception. I doubt there'd be too many families.
But there's some big benefits to be gained as well, if you can get past that, the fear and angst part of it.
Yes.
And I guess oftentimes realise that actually it's not that bad once they start dealing with you blokes and they understand some things that they didn't understand before.
Definitely. Yeah.
And having things start to get squared away can actually take the stress off.
Yeah. And we see lots of disputes arise because after someone's death or whatever, if there is a shock or a surprise, that's often where the arguments arise. So even if you have the conversation, they're not happy, and then it happens, they're not going to be surprised by it. So, and you're better off to have your arguments while you're alive and while you can.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of this, we sit down with everyone, and I also do some of the litigation side of things when it ends up going wrong, and we're down in the Supreme Court, and it's not nice for anyone. It ruins the family, costs a fortune.
Yeah.
You don't know what the outcome's going to be. So what I generally tell people is, if you want this outcome to be in your hands, rather than a judge on a bench, and cost
a
about
small
very small investment.
now.
Yeah, correct. Unfortunately, that doesn't work all the time, and we do have some disputes down there. And yes, they do cost a lot, and it's not in anyone's best interest. But unfortunately, sometimes you can't get the deal done.
You want the money in the kid's pocket or in some silks?
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly right.
Is there common patterns of what typically leads people to end up in litigation rather than getting it sorted before then?
The hardest part that I see is when the families just don't get along to begin with. So you got a situation where, and this is generally the dispute, is where you might have 2 or 3 kids and they all don't get along. So then how are you going to pass a farm that can only is only sufficient for one? Well, yeah. Basically, you could have done it to 2, but the problem is that they don't get along. So how are they going to continue? And generally, it's not a dispute with mum and dad. It's a dispute with themselves once they get it.
Yeah.
That's what we see. They then want to break apart, but they're saying, well, if I break apart, it's not feasible. So what, we have to sell? Well, we don't want to sell. No one wants to sell farming land. They never do. And that's understandable. But, unfortunately, we can't both run this.
But it's just the mathematics of fractions sometimes. Isn't it?
Exactly right.
It's supported a family, but when that becomes 3 or 4 families, it's a lot trickier.
Yeah, exactly right.
It is.
What are the key legal considerations for families to be keeping in mind around succession?
The legal considerations are interesting. I mean, the main part, I think, is making sure you have the right structures in place. So if you have the right structures in place, you might avoid it going through a will, land going through a will, and you pass control that way. I also think documenting things, I mean, it's not really a legal consideration, but just making sure that there is a contract or something in place. For example, if somebody wants to pass down, parents want to pass down, at the age of 60, well, they've still got to live.
Yeah.
So a lot of the time I see people say, okay, well, I'm going to pass control of the land, but they haven't thought about, well, what happens if, my kids go rogue and don't talk to me again, and I've got no super, no nothing. I've just given them everything, and I expected that they were going to continue to fund me.
Have you seen that happen?
Yes, I've got one at the moment, where the land got transferred, and unfortunately they talked about a succession deed and some money to be paid on a monthly basis, and now the children have said no.
Things change.
They've had a fight. So we make sure that if we're going to do anything, we make sure we document everything. It's not 55-page documents or anything, but we make sure it's documented, so that people have a legal right to come back and say, well, no, I'm entitled to be paid some money, or transfer it back to me.
Yeah, you can't just take everything on trust, and it's tough because it's family, but this is business that you're talking about as well, and you're not supposed to mix those sometimes.
No.
Families are volatile.
But, agriculture always has. So, it's something that needs to get right. It's a thing we talk about a lot in the wine industry about vineyards, and the great vineyards are generational because it's a forward projection. Vineyard, you can't think about next year. You're thinking about 20 years' time. Are there unique qualities in vineyard succession that need to be considered?
I'm not sure about that. I think, land is land, and a farm is a farm. I don't think it's any different to cropping, grazing land, really, on the basis that, you've got to be, if you're going to transfer it, it's got to be sufficient for everybody.
Yeah.
So I suppose the one thing you got to think about is, if we're going to go through some bad years, or I need to replace the vines with some other vines, and how that might work out, and if that's the case, how am I going to pay mum and dad to continue living, and those sort of things. So I suppose you probably will have to have a sort of 5-year thought process.
Yeah.
Future thought process.
Yeah, but like you said, there's a different trajectory in value for cropping land than there is probably for vineyard land, right? At the moment.
At the moment, yeah.
One thing that can pop up occasionally is if there's different aspects of the business. So if there is, say, a restaurant or something similar.
Correct.
So then there's, we've seen instances of, multiple children in the business doing various different roles.
Yeah.
That can probably be a significant consideration as opposed to, broadacre farming or whatever it might be. So we do see that occasionally as well.
How do inheritance laws in SA impact transfer to the next generation?
A lot, yeah. It has a fair bit to do with it, yeah. And as we said before, it's a big part of why we try to move land to take it out of remove the possibility of an inheritance claim. Having said that, though, there is some new legislation coming in called the Succession Act. So that's passed, but not yet in effect. So critically, at the moment, there's a test. The main test is have if they're making a claim, have they been provided for? Whereas my understanding is the way they're changing that is it's going to be more about what were the deceased wishes. So hopefully
they're written down.
Yeah, hopefully that has an impact. But at the moment, yeah, we're still just ploughing on with trying to avoid passing through a will if we can.
Yeah, the biggest issue is if you hold land in your own name. Mm. So if it's personal estate, it passes through a will. It's open to the Inheritance Family Provision Act, which is basically, claims. If you have land in, say, a trust, at the moment, I'm not saying this is foolproof forever, but at the moment you can pass that trust without it getting caught up in that regime.
Yeah.
So whilst trusts are good for asset protection, they also have difficulties when you're dealing with them from an estate planning point of view, because you're passing control of a trust and nobody actually owns anything in the trust. So whilst it's good to pass control, if you've got 2 or 3 kids, how do you deal with that with a trust? So whilst trusts are probably, we always say if you've got land, unless there's a reason why you'd have a company, we would always put it into a trust rather than your own name, purely for the succession issue. It also complicates your estate planning, succession planning, because there have to be other factors considered.
What are some of the other financial considerations?
From the financial consideration, really, you're just looking at the major issue is tax. And also, I suppose at the end of the day, from a succession plan point of view, it's really looking at tax and making sure that you can do it. As I said, if you've got a capital gains tax problem and you end up with a $3 million tax capital gain that you can't wipe, then nobody's going to do a succession plan in that year. They just can't. The other thing people have to be careful of, and you've got children wanting to take over a farm, whether it's any type of farming, they're going to be taking over overdrafts as well in a business. They're going to be taking over debt. Can they service the debt? Is it something that they want to take on? Because at the end of the day, is the farm manageable or not? Thanks, Mum and Dad, for giving me the farm, but all of a sudden,
you give me a bundle of problems as well.
I can't afford to pay the debt. Interest rates are going up. So, and you want me to pay you out as well, some money, or fund me. I'm not sure how we're going to do this. So there does need to be accounting considerations, and the accountants get involved and work out whether or not this is feasible.
Can you take us through a bit of a do's and don'ts? I know that it's subjective and every situation's a bit different, but
don't have too many kids.
That's right.
Keep it under 4.
Look, all I could say on that is don't bury your head in the sand. So often we've seen people, they might even come to see me and have a quick chat, and ultimately they then don't do anything because they can't decide what they want. They can't decide what's fair or what, whatever. And, untimely death and it's no good for anyone. So that's the definite don't, even if it's just continuing to have a conversation, continue thinking about it, but just don't bury your head in the sand and leave it, set and forget type stuff. So that's definitely a don't. I think for me, the big do is think about communication. So do definitely communicate with others about it. Again, you have to think about your own family and work out whether that's an appropriate thing to do. But I feel like if there's a bit more communication amongst the family group about what everyone is intending to do, then that can help along the way.
Try to avoid surprises.
Yeah, try to avoid surprises, exactly. So
unfortunately, you have a lot of people, though, that say, well, I'll be dead, so not my problem then. So what does it matter? But, unfortunately, I think, we're trying to educate people to say, well, that's not really the greatest way to think about it for the rest, for the rest of the family. You could just leave it to whoever you want in a will and let them all fight about it, but you may not end up with, whilst you're not around, you may not end up with a farm much longer afterwards. When everyone starts fighting, or there's inheritance disputes and things like that. So,
and legacy matters to people.
Yeah, correct. But I also think people out in the country go to the pub, they know what happens around the place, they hear about some horror stories that are going around, people talking about it in the pub, and they start thinking, wait a minute, I don't want my family to be that. Now, it may be that it's inevitable that it ends up that way, but at least they could try and do something about it. So I think my do is do something.
Yeah, it's always better to do something.
Yeah.
Yeah, do something. Even if it's not perfect, do something that you can live with.
And a bit of a positive reframing around it somehow, rather than just thinking about what I want to avoid at all costs, is, you know, how could we take some of the tension away and make things better now if we actually had maybe one uncomfortable conversation to open the floodgates, rather than putting everything into avoiding that until 10 years later it
exactly.
blows up in your face.
Well, I mean, and a lot of in the you know, like Barossa and these places which have very strong European influence there, you know, it was always about, well, whoever's on the farm gets the farm, and if you're my son, you get it all.
Yeah.
And you know, it's still around, but people are being educated to now find other, you know, assets, get other assets, bring it into super and things, to now be able to pass over to other
To a
children.
more diversified asset
That's right.
spread.
But it is still around, but it's nowhere near what it was.
As long as we don't get French and Napoleonic on, you know, inheritance, and tax and all that sort of stuff. I mean,
Yes.
that's done devastating things in France for
Correct.
vineyard. Is this stuff taught well in ag colleges and things as part of, you know, farm management courses and things? I mean, do you know if it's being...
I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's taught in law schools, but, you know, but these people are going away to, you know, learn farm management and that kind of stuff. It should be something that...
I think there's a lot of sort of programs being run around the place now, teaching them, you know, business management and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But I think that's also coupled in with, what is succession planning and how does it work and things like that. So I've seen a bit of that around, but
Yeah, it just prepares people, you know, for when they come and see you. They might be, you know, better placed to ask the right questions, or at least get
Also,
the ball
there's
rolling.
a lot of people have already been educated by their accountants along the way. So, you know, as lawyers, we tend to see people on a need-to-know basis.
Yeah.
Accountants or financial planners see people every year to do their books. So they generally will sit down with them and go through that process with them of, you know, okay, well, what does this now look like for the next 5 years for you? So a lot of the time we do get involved at that stage, but a lot of the time we get involved after that. A lot of that's already happened.
Yeah.
And then just implement it. But it's definitely on everyone's radar compared to probably 30 years ago.
Yeah.
For listeners thinking about getting the ball rolling, should they be looking at bringing in the experts, yourselves, accountants, etc., from the get-go, or are there conversations to have beforehand? What do you
I think from the
typically-
get-go, there's nothing, nothing wrong with bringing people in early, and it can, we've got some sort of first-generation farmers that are just setting up new entities to trade through and, you know, dip their toes in the water. And certainly I'm having conversations with those guys and getting them set up properly from the start. So there's definitely no issue, you know, the sooner you can get in and you know, we're happy to have conversations with people and see if they need our help or not. Yeah, it's definitely not. You don't have to be, there's no age or criteria or whatever to start having those conversations about succession planning, how things should be set up. That should be happening from the get-go, definitely.
I think it always helps though if the family can get to a point they're on the same page from a general principle, because then they can come and get the advice based on, well, this is what we're thinking. When you look at our books, when you look at the structures, how do we make this happen?
Yeah. But maybe there's some value in seeing you first before you then go back to the family and have that conversation, because at least you've got some shape around that conversation and you can direct it a bit and then come back and get the ball rolling.
And we could often flag issues as well. So we might
you might want to discuss this. And that, you know, most people probably haven't thought of that until you've, you know, raised it.
Yeah, I do tend to find that children do tend to be in their parents' ears about this a fair bit.
Yeah.
So there are conversations that generally they're generally being had outside of us a lot of the time. So by the time they get to us, whilst they might say, this is the initial stage, I'm pretty sure there's probably been about 3 or 4 years of ear badgering in the meantime.
Cost of living and all that.
Yeah.
Exactly right.
What about the process of transition, keeping the business going while that's happening? What strategies can be put in place during that transfer period where there's lots of stuff going on?
Probably not a whole heap, because you've got to remember that most of the time, if you're passing control of your land business, generally speaking, the kids are already going to be working in the business.
Yeah.
So really it's, and they're probably, I've said this most of the time, they're probably running it, to be honest. And I mean, there's two ways you can do it. One is you bring them in, over time. So they do have some skin in the game for a while and they see what's happening. I mean, I see a lot of the time where people will bring them into the, a partnership business or something like that, but they'll keep the land. So we just hold the land, but bring them in there so they learn how to run the business, etc. And then later on, they'll pass the rest of it all over.
And bringing them in earlier is better, as with everything.
Well, they still have to be ready though. So, we've seen a lot of kids come home and they might work for a decade and still not have any sort of control whatsoever. Yeah, but I've heard of others that have been back for a couple of years and are fully into it and doing a good job, and the parents want to bring them in as soon as possible. So it does depend a little bit, but there's definitely no set time frame in that one. But
yeah, I do. I tend to see that a lot of the time they'll bring the kids into the partnership business to begin with, and then they'll transition themselves out of that, and they'll deal with the land separately. Every now and then it's just a whole transition, but the reality is, if they're already in the business, nothing changes. All we have to do is transfer names over and potentially get a new ABN and change the loans for machinery and those sort of things. But nothing really changes if everyone's already been in the business.
Yeah. What about success stories of times you've seen people really get this right? And is there a riding off into the sunset scenario where everyone's happy and you've seen that make family units stronger if they put the work in and they get the outcome that they want?
Yeah, I mean, I had one where we had two brothers who had a significant amount of land and running their business. And basically we separated the two of them, but then we also passed the succession of one of them down to the children, his children. And so it was a 2-in-1 type thing. It took a fair while to do it and get it right. But there was the hallmarks of this thing. If it went horribly, it could go horribly wrong and everybody would lose out. Now, was everyone 100% happy? No. But I don't think there's ever going to be a situation, unfortunately, in these cases, that everyone's going to be 100% happy. Could they live with it? Could they now go off and run their own businesses so there's no more fighting and in the future? Yes, I think that's the best you're going to get. There are sometimes people who walk out there and say this was the best result and things like that, but again, I still don't think you'll ever see 100%.
Yeah. But don't let perfection be the enemy of...
Yeah, exactly.
No way.
Right. Yeah.
No way.
Get a result that everyone can live with.
Correct.
Yeah. And often we don't see the end result at times if there's no litigation or, any claims arising out of what we've done, then a lot of the times we just assume it's all going well.
Well, yeah, that's a tick, right?
Yeah.
Well, that is the tick. If they're not coming to see you within the next couple of years, it's all good.
Yeah.
In moments where disaster strikes and then things aren't sort of properly settled and lined up, what are the key things that have to happen really quickly in that sort of period where everyone's losing their minds? It's a really difficult position. What are some key steps that people should think about that might help through a really difficult period?
Oh, look, I think the first thing is to try to get some sort of conciliation or mediation or something going to try to, it's a difficult one because as soon as everybody lawyers up, all of a sudden people can hide behind lawyers, and that's a fact. So all of a sudden it's quite easy to just get your lawyer to write whatever you want to the other side and not deal with it. I actually think the best way to deal with it is to actually sit in a room together, all of you, and try and deal with it. Now, unfortunately, sometimes it's got that far that that's just never going to happen. The longer it lingers without any try to get some sort of resolution by mediation or conciliation or something, the worse it's going to get, the more hatred there's going to be, the more it's principle and not commercial. And unfortunately, a lot of the time with these, with agricultural, it is principle. It's got nothing to do about the commercial side of it. It's the fact that I want the farm, you're not having it. And I was promised it, and you're getting a bit now, and I was promised it. So
because farms aren't simple businesses; they're people's lives. And
correct. And sometimes there's no commercial reality in it. So to be able to try to mediate or something and try and take the sting out of it early, and then realise that it's a commercial decision that's being made here, not a principal decision, I think that's the most important part.
Yep.
So get in a room and talk about it as soon as possible.
If you
Yeah.
can, yeah.
Try to take the principle out of it and realise that it's a commercial. As much as it's family, as much as it's land that's been there forever, it's a commercial transaction we're talking about here, and you may lose it all.
Yeah. And that's the worst possible outcome.
That is
Exactly right.
I suppose it can become a different conversation quickly once those emotions are really heightened when there's been a sudden death or something. And it might be the same conversation factually, but because you're having it 6 months later after you've lost someone suddenly, all of a sudden the tensions are way up and perhaps those conversations are going very differently.
Yeah.
It's interesting because I've seen on numerous occasions where everybody plays ball because mum and dad are still around.
Yeah.
Once mum and dad go, this hatred of you did this back in when you were 15 years old and I was 18 and I've never forgotten it, but now mum and dad are around, I don't care, they were the ones holding us together and all these sort of things. So, and that's the other thing for mum and dad to realise if you leave it to a will, is that, you know, you don't know about all these underlying things that might have been sitting around and simmering. You know, get it right and make sure it's a plan that you want, not what they're going to potentially, what the outcome between them could be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I have seen it happen numerous occasions where it just blows up once mum and dad disappear.
So don't leave it all up to the kids.
And don't leave it all up to, and don't leave it all up to just simply a will.
Definitely not.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
No.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground there. Is there any other things to remember before we wrap it up?
Oh, maybe incapacity. So sometimes people forget to factor in, well, what happens if they lose their capacity? So obviously making sure that conversation is had as well. So making sure a power of attorney is in place.
So dementia?
Yeah, dementia or, you know, it could be a car accident or, you know, whatever. So, because it, particularly if you're dealing with trusts and that, it may not be, you know, completely clear what will happen if you lost your capacity. So we're often having that conversation not only around succession or on death, but also on incapacity. So that's always something to bear in mind.
Another thing people don't want to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, dead right.
I think another thing is, and I'll try not to get into the technical side of it, but people who do have land in trusts, if you have minor children and you want to pass that to minor children, you're passing control of a trust, and minors can't take control of a trust.
Yep.
So most people come to me and say, well, I'll just leave it to a family member. But you've got to remember in a trust that a family member is potentially a beneficiary of that trust. So if they go rogue on you, they could potentially transfer everything to themselves and your kids get nothing. So whilst wills do seem quite, you know, it might not be so complicated, I'm just going to pass control of this trust. Being the right person and getting the right advice as to who that person might be and trust them and maybe put 2 or 3 people in or an independent person is important, because I think with land going up in value, the way it has around the place and what the value of the land, you know, land is now, there may be temptations there.
Yeah. Do your best to avoid the worst sort of possible outcome. Maybe don't have complete and utter faith in humankind.
Yeah.
That's right. Unfortunately, as always,
a little level of loyalty cynicism can be useful.
Well, our job's largely to think about, well, if the worst case scenario happens, what will happen?
Yeah.
So you did right. You can't.
And 95 times out of 100, it might not. But
Yeah,
for
exactly.
those 5 times that it does,
Yeah.
you'd be pretty happy to have covered your own ass.
The other issue that does arise with trust deeds from time to time is sometimes, like, particularly that are, you know, might have been farming for many generations. Sometimes there's these old trust deeds that aren't fit for purpose and things like that, or there might be unintended consequences with the way that the trust deed's drafted. So we often pick up issues not only when we're preparing their will and all that, but within the trust deed itself. So we're constantly making variations to these things so that it's absolutely clear what happens on death, what happens on incapacity. You know?
Yeah, and you're sort of having to sort of update this sort of really, I mean, legislation changes and that sort of thing. Yeah, if someone said, oh, we sorted this out 20 years ago, is that plan still as good today as it was 20 years ago? Would that need to be re-looked at and
Oh, no, I mean, I think it's
sharpened
like wills. I mean, we tend to say to people, look, you should, even if nothing's changed, you should look at it every 5 years.
Yeah.
You know, if legislation changed, we'd be telling people pretty quickly to get them in and change some things. I mean, who knows what's going to happen with trusts in the future? There's already murmurings by political parties about, dealing with, income that's come from trusts and things like that and how to deal with it. And they're always changing things around about who can get it for tax advantages and concessions and things. So, but at this stage, it's probably still the model we would favour when it comes to land. We can be swayed in different ways, and it also comes back to accounting as well, because the accountant will generally have an idea as to what might be the best for tax. But as I said, people do sit with accountants and go through these things. So, if financially, wait a minute, this might not look right for the next 5 years, probably starts there, and then they come and see us, and we'll sit around together and do it. But I'd probably think with the accountant, you're probably looking at it every year.
Yeah, and really worth building those relationships with the accountant, with the lawyer, just so that you've got that there. And if there are changes to legislation or things do change in the family, you're not then making the initial call. You've already got someone that you've got a relationship with that you feel comfortable with, and you can get the ball rolling.
Yeah, and also financial planners, because one of the good ways to be able to get, especially if you're young enough, good ways to get money to off-farm kids is take out life insurance. If you take out life insurance at 60, a little bit hard. You take out life insurance, you get it at 35 or 30, you might be able to hold a significant amount of life insurance that can pay out off-farm kids, or at least pay them something that they may otherwise not get. So I think having an accountant, lawyer and planner are the three important parts.
And making sure all those three work together.
That helps.
Yeah.
Got it. Well, really great information, guys, across a broad range of topics there. I think that'd be helpful if you're thinking about succession or trying to not think about it.
Yeah.
So thanks very much for coming in and sharing that with us. It's real valuable stuff.
Thanks,
No worries,
guys.
thanks for having
No
us.
worries. Pleasure.
Thanks for listening. Head to the Wine Grape Council of South Australia website for links and further resources. This is part of a bigger conversation, so feel free to share this podcast with your mates and look after yourselves. Cheers.